The most expensive mistake a billionaire can make is assuming he knows who matters. At exactly 12:07 p.m., Ethan Montgomery made that mistake. The lunch crowd filled every table inside Montgomery House, the flagship restaurant attached to the headquarters of his billion-dollar hospitality empire in downtown Chicago. Crystal glasses caught the midday sunlight. Silverware clinked softly against white porcelain plates. Executives discussed mergers over steak salads. Tourists took photos near the grand staircase. Everything looked perfect, at least from a distance. Ethan stood near the center of the dining room, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it seemed carved onto his frame. At 42, he had built a reputation for seeing problems before anyone else did. Investors trusted him. Competitors feared him. Employees rarely questioned him, which was why the silence felt so unnatural when he suddenly stopped walking. His steel gray eyes settled on a waitress standing beside table 14. Claire Bennett, 28 years old, blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, blue eyes calm as winter water, a black apron, a small notepad in one hand. Nothing about her appearance suggested she would become the center of the most important day of Ethan Montgomery's life. Yet there she was, standing perfectly still while a frustrated customer pointed toward a spilled glass of iced tea. The accident had happened less than 30 seconds earlier. A young busboy had bumped the edge of the table while carrying a tray. The glass tipped. The drink spilled across a designer jacket. The customer demanded answers. The manager rushed over. The busboy froze. And somehow, within moments, all eyes landed on Claire. Ethan crossed the room. The sound of his Italian dress shoes echoed against the marble floor. Employees instinctively stepped aside. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. "Is this your section?" he asked. Claire looked at him. "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady. "Then explain why this happened." Several employees exchanged nervous glances. Claire could have blamed the busboy. She could have argued. She could have defended herself. Instead, she simply said, "The mistake can be corrected." Ethan's jaw tightened. He hated answers that sounded like lessons. "That wasn't my question." The customer folded his arms dramatically. The manager stared at the floor. Somewhere in the distance, an espresso machine hissed. Claire remained calm. "No one was hurt. We can replace the jacket cleaning costs and make it right." Ethan laughed once. "Cold. Short. Sharp. That's not your decision to make." The room seemed to shrink. Every conversation faded into the background. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, then met his gaze again. Not defiant. Not afraid. Simply steady. For reasons Ethan couldn't explain, that irritated him even more. "You're done here," he said. A collective breath swept through the restaurant. Claire blinked once. "Sir." Effective immediately. The words landed like stones. "Turn in your badge and leave the property." The manager looked shocked. Several servers stared openly. One hostess covered her mouth. Yet Claire did not argue. She did not plead. She simply nodded. The silence became heavier than any shouting could have been. Slowly, she untied her apron, folded it carefully, placed it on the nearest service station. Then she reached into her pocket and removed a small folded piece of paper. Without a word, she placed it beside the apron. Ethan barely glanced at it. "Security will escort you out." Claire gave a faint smile that never reached her eyes. Then she said something nobody in the room understood. "Not yet. By midnight," she said softly. "You'll wish someone had read that note." For the first time all afternoon, a strange feeling crossed Ethan Montgomery's face. It lasted less than a second. Then it disappeared. He turned away. The restaurant resumed breathing. Conversations restarted. Glasses clinked again. Claire Bennett walked toward the front doors beneath the golden afternoon sunlight. No one followed her. No one stopped her. And on the service station behind her, the folded note remained untouched, quietly waiting for the countdown to begin. The revolving door closed behind Claire Bennett with a soft whisper, and just like that, she disappeared into the river of people moving along Michigan Avenue. The cold October wind tugged at her hair as she crossed the street without looking back. Most people would have felt anger. Some would have felt humiliation. Claire felt neither. She simply felt tired. Inside Montgomery House, the lunch rush continued as though nothing had happened. Managers returned to their stations. Servers carried trays. Customers resumed conversations about investments, vacation homes, and quarterly earnings. Yet something lingered in the air, an uncomfortable weight, the kind people noticed without understanding why. Near the service station, Claire's folded note remained exactly where she had left it. Unopened, ignored, forgotten, at least for now. Ethan Montgomery stood inside a glass conference room on the 34th floor overlooking downtown Chicago. The skyline stretched beneath gray clouds. Lake Michigan looked like polished steel. Around the table sat senior executives responsible for different divisions of Montgomery Holdings. The weekly strategy meeting had already started 20 minutes late, which irritated Ethan more than he cared to admit. Numbers appeared across a massive screen. Revenue forecasts, expansion projections, acquisition opportunities. Normally, Ethan absorbed information faster than anyone in the room. Today, his attention drifted. Not because of the firing. He had terminated employees before. Difficult decisions came with leadership. At least that was what he always told himself. No. What bothered him was the look Claire had given him before leaving. Not fear. Not resentment. Certainty. As if she knew something he did not. Ethan pushed the thought aside. Continue, he said. The chief financial officer nodded and advanced to the next slide. We expect final confirmation from the Zurich Consortium at 6 o'clock tonight. Ethan relaxed slightly. That deal mattered. Nearly $800 million in international financing. 2 years of negotiations. Hundreds of jobs depending on the outcome. Everything appeared on schedule. Across the city, Claire entered a modest apartment building 3 miles from downtown. The elevator groaned as it carried her upward. Inside apartment 5B, silence greeted her. A small kitchen, a worn couch, shelves filled with books. Nothing luxurious, nothing impressive, yet everything had a purpose. Claire placed her purse on the table and removed her phone. 12 missed messages waited for her. Co-workers, friends, one concerned manager. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened a laptop sitting beside a stack of notebooks. The screen illuminated her face. Calm, focused, methodical. Lines of financial data filled the display. Charts, forecasts, risk assessments, documents connected to companies across 3 continents. She studied them quietly. Then her eyes settled on one file. A file carrying the Montgomery Holdings logo. Claire stared at it for several seconds before slowly closing the computer. Outside her window, clouds thickened above the city. The afternoon sunlight faded behind approaching rain. Somewhere downtown, an executive assistant hurried toward Ethan's office carrying a tablet. Her face had lost all color. Sir, she said breathlessly after entering. We just received a message from Zurich. Ethan looked up. The room fell silent. The assistant swallowed hard. They postponed the final approval meeting. For the first time that day, a crack appeared in Ethan Montgomery's confidence. It was small, barely visible, but it was there, and the countdown had officially begun. The conference room remained silent long after the assistant finished speaking. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through the hallways carrying coffee cups and laptops, completely unaware that the foundation of a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars had just shifted beneath their feet. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Postponed for how long, he asked. The assistant glanced at the tablet. They did not specify, sir. They only requested additional verification before proceeding. Additional verification. The phrase sounded harmless. Professional. Routine. Yet something about it felt wrong. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses. That is unusual. We completed every compliance requirement 3 weeks ago. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. Gray clouds hung low above Chicago. The lake had disappeared behind a curtain of mist. He had spent 2 years building trust with the Zurich Consortium. They were meticulous, predictable. They did not postpone major decisions without a reason. Find out what changed, Ethan said. The room immediately came alive. Phones appeared. Messages were sent. Executives rushed into motion. Everyone moved faster when Ethan's voice carried that particular tone. Across the city, Claire sat alone at a small coffee shop near her apartment. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The afternoon crowd was thin. A college student studied near the entrance. An elderly couple shared a blueberry muffin in silence. Claire wrapped both hands around a cup of black coffee. Her laptop sat open in front of her. Lines of data reflected in her blue eyes. Numbers rarely lied. People did. That was why she trusted numbers more. Her phone vibrated. Another message from a former coworker. Are you okay? Claire read it and smiled faintly. Then she closed the message without replying. Her attention returned to the screen. A digital clock in the corner showed 3:14 p.m. 7 hours remained until midnight. Back at Montgomery Holdings, answers arrived slowly. None of them made Ethan feel better. By 4 o'clock, 3 separate departments reported unusual discrepancies inside documents connected to the Zurich transaction. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. A missing verification code. An outdated compliance reference. A risk model that contained assumptions no longer matching current market conditions. Individually, each issue seemed minor. Together, they formed a pattern. Ethan stared at the reports spread across his desk. His instincts had built an empire. Those instincts now whispered the same warning repeatedly. Someone should have caught this. Someone should have seen it weeks ago. Then another thought surfaced. Uninvited. Uncomfortable. Claire's face. Her calm expression. The note she had left behind. Ethan dismissed it immediately. It was coincidence. Nothing more. Yet, as evening approached, the feeling refused to disappear. At 5:42 p.m., his chief legal officer entered without knocking. That alone signaled trouble. "We have another issue," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. Her expression told him everything before she spoke. "The Zurich team believes there may be undisclosed exposure hidden inside one of our international subsidiaries." The room suddenly felt smaller. Rain began striking the windows harder. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled across the city. Ethan glanced toward the darkening skyline. For the first time all day, he looked at the clock. Then he remembered Claire's words. By midnight, he hated that he remembered them at all. By 6:30 in the evening, the rain had settled over Chicago like a gray curtain. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. Traffic crawled through downtown. Inside Montgomery Holdings, however, nobody was thinking about the weather anymore. Every department was focused on the same question. What had gone wrong? Ethan stood alone in his office, staring at the city below. His reflection floated across the glass. Calm on the outside, calculating on the inside. He had spent 20 years solving problems. That was why investors trusted him with billions of dollars. That was why newspapers called him a visionary. Yet tonight, every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." His chief financial officer entered carrying another folder. Not a tablet, not an email. A printed folder. Ethan immediately recognized the significance. Important findings were still delivered on paper. "You need to see this." Ethan opened the file. The first page contained a timeline. The second contained internal correspondence. The third contained a list of unresolved concerns. His eyes narrowed. Every item shared one thing in common. The same employee identification number appeared repeatedly beside recommendations, warnings, and risk assessments submitted during the previous 6 months. Ethan looked up. "Who is this?" The chief financial officer hesitated. "Claire Bennett." Silence filled the office. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Ethan turned back to the pages. The reports continued. Potential exposure in overseas subsidiaries. Weaknesses in compliance verification. Concerns regarding outdated assumptions used in forecasting models. Every issue currently threatening the Zurich deal appeared inside these documents. Weeks ago, some had been submitted months earlier. Ethan flipped through the pages faster. His jaw tightened. Why was a waitress writing financial risk reports? The chief financial officer looked uncomfortable. Because she was not originally hired as a waitress. Ethan stared at him. "Explain." The older man inhaled slowly. 3 years ago, she worked in strategic analysis for one of our acquired companies. During restructuring, her division was eliminated. She accepted a temporary position inside the hospitality branch while caring for a sick family member. She never complained, never requested special treatment. Most people assumed she preferred staying there. Ethan said nothing. The explanation landed harder than he expected. He remembered her carrying trays, taking orders, folding napkins. He remembered dismissing her without a second thought. Yet while everyone else saw a waitress, she had apparently spent years quietly identifying risks nobody else noticed. The office suddenly felt colder. "Why was I never informed?" he asked. "Because nobody thought it mattered." The words hung in the air. Nobody thought it mattered. Ethan looked toward the storm outside. Somewhere across the city, Claire Bennett was likely sitting in her small apartment while an entire executive team struggled with problems she had already predicted. His phone vibrated. An incoming message from Zurich. The room grew silent again. Ethan opened it immediately. The message was brief, professional, polite, and devastating. Unless satisfactory explanations could be provided before midnight, the consortium would suspend negotiations indefinitely. Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. For the first time all evening, he glanced toward the clock not with irritation, but with concern. 8 minutes past 7. Less than 5 hours remained. By 8 o'clock, the atmosphere inside Montgomery Holdings had changed completely. Earlier, employees had moved with confidence. Now they moved with urgency. Conversations became whispers. Elevators opened and closed nonstop. Conference rooms that normally sat dark after business hours glowed with light. The entire building felt awake, alert, and uneasy. Ethan remained in the executive war room overlooking the city. Jackets had been removed. Coffee cups covered the table. Computer screens displayed financial models, compliance reports, and communication logs. Yet despite the effort, progress remained painfully slow. Every answer uncovered another problem. Every correction revealed another inconsistency. It was as if someone had left a trail of warnings nobody had followed. The chief legal officer pointed toward a screen. This issue alone could delay approval for weeks. Ethan rubbed his temple. Weeks are not an option. Across the room, another executive looked up from a report. There is something else. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What now? The executive hesitated before answering. The original recommendations were correct. Silence followed. What do you mean? Ethan asked. The executive turned the monitor. Several highlighted sections appeared on the screen. Each carried Claire Bennett's name. Each contained recommendations that would have prevented the current crisis. Updated verification procedures. Revised exposure calculations. Independent reviews of international subsidiaries. Everything the Zurich consortium now demanded had already been proposed. Months ago, nobody approved the changes. Nobody acted. Ethan stared at the screen. A strange feeling settled over him. It was not anger. It was something rarer. Regret. He thought about the folded note sitting downstairs in the restaurant. The note he had ignored. The note Claire had left behind with complete confidence. Outside, rain streamed down the windows in silver lines. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. The clock on the wall read 8:17 p.m. Less than 4 hours remained. Meanwhile, Claire sat quietly in her apartment. A lamp illuminated the living room with soft amber light. The television remained off. Music played softly from a nearby speaker. She looked nothing like the center of a corporate emergency. A paperback novel rested open beside her. A cup of tea cooled on the coffee table. Yet every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward her phone. Not because she expected a call, because she knew one was coming. She had spent years studying patterns. Markets. Organizations. People. The easiest patterns to predict were often human. Especially pride. Pride always followed the same cycle. Confidence. Dismissal. Resistance. Then realization. Her phone remained silent. For now. Back downtown, another message arrived from Zurich. Ethan opened it immediately. The response was shorter than the previous one. More direct. The consortium required complete clarification before midnight or discussions would be suspended indefinitely. No extensions. No exceptions. The room grew quiet after reading it. Everyone understood what was at stake. Hundreds of jobs. Years of planning. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. His gaze moved across the executives around the table. Some looked exhausted. Others looked defeated. For the first time all evening, he asked a question nobody expected. Has anyone actually read the note Claire left behind? No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. Ethan looked toward the door. Somewhere below, inside the restaurant where this entire day had begun, a small folded piece of paper was still waiting. The elevator descended through 34 floors of silence. Ethan stood alone inside the mirrored cabin, watching his reflection stare back at him. The man looking back appeared exactly the same as he had that morning. Same suit, same watch, same confidence carved into his posture. Yet something had changed. The certainty was gone. When the doors opened into the restaurant lobby, the familiar scent of coffee and polished wood greeted him. Hours earlier, this place had felt like part of his kingdom. Tonight it felt different. Quieter. Almost judgmental. A few late customers remained scattered among the tables. Staff moved carefully, aware that something unusual was happening. Ethan walked directly toward the service station. The folded note was still there. Exactly where Claire had left it. Untouched. Waiting. He stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. The paper felt ordinary, lightweight, unremarkable, yet his pulse quickened slightly as he unfolded it. The message contained only 3 sentences. No accusations, no anger, no attempt at revenge. That was what surprised him most. Claire had every reason to be bitter. Instead, her handwriting remained calm and precise. The first sentence listed the name of the subsidiary currently causing concern with the Zurich consortium. The second identified the exact compliance issue creating the delay. The third sentence was even shorter. Check the exposure report dated April 17th. Ethan read the note twice. Then a third time. His eyes narrowed. April 17th. The date sounded familiar. Very familiar. He immediately pulled out his phone and called the chief financial officer. Find the exposure report from April 17th. The response came instantly. Sir, we reviewed hundreds of reports. Find that one. The line went silent for a moment. Then came a simple answer. Yes, sir. 20 minutes later, Ethan was back upstairs. Rain continued striking the windows. The city beyond looked blurred and distant. Executives crowded around a conference table as the requested report finally appeared on screen. The room grew quiet. Then quieter still. Claire had been right. Not partially right. Completely right. Hidden inside the report was the precise discrepancy now threatening the entire Zurich agreement. A discrepancy identified months ago and dismissed by managers who believed it posed no meaningful risk. Ethan stared at the screen. Around him, nobody spoke. The evidence was undeniable. Claire had seen the problem before everyone else. She had documented it, reported it, explained it, and nobody listened, including him. The clock on the wall showed 9:41 p.m. Less than 3 hours remained. The chief legal officer finally broke the silence. Can we fix it? Nobody answered immediately. Eventually, the chief financial officer exhaled slowly. Maybe. Under normal circumstances, Ethan hated that word. Tonight it sounded almost optimistic. What are we missing? He asked. Another silence followed. Then one executive looked up from the report. We are missing the person who wrote it. The words settled heavily across the room. No one disagreed. No one argued. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark Chicago skyline. Across town, Claire sat beside her apartment window watching rain slide down the glass. Her tea had gone cold. Her book remained open but unread. She glanced at the clock, then toward her silent phone. A faint smile touched her lips. The realization had finally happened. The only question now was how long pride would delay the next step. The clock reached 10:03 p.m., and the mood inside Montgomery Holdings shifted once again. The panic was gone. Panic required uncertainty. What remained now was something far more uncomfortable. Clarity. Everyone in the room finally understood the truth. The problem was no longer finding the source of the crisis. The source had already been identified. The problem was that the one person who truly understood it was no longer part of the company. Ethan stood near the conference room window, watching rain sweep across the skyline. The city lights shimmered through the storm like distant stars. Behind him, teams continued reviewing reports and preparing responses for Zurich, but the energy felt different. Forced. Incomplete. Every solution seemed to stop halfway. Every explanation raised new questions. The chief financial officer closed another report and shook his head. We can answer some of their concerns. Ethan turned. Some. Not all. The answer hung in the air. Nobody challenged it. Nobody offered an alternative, because everyone knew what he meant. Claire's reports had identified the weaknesses. Her notes explained the risks. Yet many of her conclusions referenced supporting analysis that nobody could locate. She had built a map. Unfortunately, most people had ignored it until the storm arrived. Across town, Claire finally received the call she expected. Her phone vibrated softly on the coffee table. She looked at the screen. Not Ethan. One of the managers from Montgomery House. Claire let it ring twice before answering. Hello. The manager sounded nervous. Claire, I know this is awkward. She smiled faintly. Then it is probably important. A brief silence followed. The company is looking into some reports you submitted. Claire glanced toward the rain outside her window. I assumed they would eventually. They are saying you may have been right. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Not because she felt satisfaction. Because she felt sad. Being right rarely felt rewarding when the warning had been ignored. How bad is it? The manager asked quietly. Claire looked toward the digital clock near her bookshelf. 10:11 p.m. Less than 2 hours remained. Bad enough that they are finally reading what they should have read months ago. The manager did not know how to respond. Neither did she. After a few polite words, the call ended. Silence returned to the apartment. Meanwhile, downtown, another message arrived from Zurich. Ethan opened it immediately. The response contained a list of additional questions. Specific questions. Technical questions. The kind that required deep familiarity with the underlying analysis. The room grew quieter with every line. Finally, the chief legal officer lowered her tablet. Can we answer all of these tonight? Nobody spoke. Ethan already knew the answer before anyone said it. The chief financial officer exhaled slowly. Not without Claire. Rain struck the glass harder. Thunder rolled somewhere over Lake Michigan. Ethan stared at the city below. For years he had believed leadership meant always having the answers. Tonight he faced a truth he had spent his entire career avoiding. Sometimes leadership meant admitting when someone else knew more than you. The clock changed to 10:18 p.m. And for the first time since noon, Ethan Montgomery stopped asking how to solve the crisis and started asking himself a different question. How was he going to face the woman he had fired only hours earlier? At 10:37 p.m., Ethan finally made the decision he had been resisting for hours. The conference room had fallen into an exhausted silence. Empty coffee cups lined the table. Computer screens cast pale blue light across tired faces. Nobody needed to say it anymore. The answer sat in front of them. Claire Bennett. The woman everyone had overlooked. The woman Ethan himself had dismissed in less than 60 seconds. He picked up his phone. Get me her address. Nobody looked surprised. In fact, several executives appeared relieved, as though the room had been waiting for those words all evening. Within minutes, a file arrived on his screen. A modest apartment building on the north side of the city. Ethan stared at the address longer than necessary. Strange. He had spent years visiting luxury hotels, private clubs, and corporate headquarters around the world. Yet this simple address made him more uncomfortable than any boardroom ever had. Across town, Claire stood beside her apartment window watching the storm drift through the city. Rain slid down the glass in silver streams. The skyline glowed softly beneath low clouds. Her phone rested on the table beside her. Still silent. She knew why. Pride rarely surrendered all at once. It negotiated, delayed, rationalized. It searched for another answer even after finding the correct one. Her gaze drifted toward the clock. 10:41 p.m. Time was running out. Back at Montgomery Holdings, another response arrived from Zurich. This one was different. Less formal. More urgent. The consortium had identified additional inconsistencies connected to the exposure analysis. They required immediate clarification. Failure to respond before midnight would trigger suspension of negotiations. Ethan read the message slowly, then handed the tablet to his chief financial officer. The older man read it and closed his eyes briefly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, one executive whispered what everyone already knew. We are out of time. Ethan looked around the room. The faces surrounding him represented decades of experience. Elite universities, prestigious careers, extraordinary salaries. Yet tonight none of them possessed the one thing they needed most. Claire's understanding of the problem. Ethan slipped on his jacket. Where are you going? The chief legal officer asked. He paused near the door. The answer felt unfamiliar. Humbling. Necessary. To ask for help. Outside, cold rain greeted him immediately. The driver opened the door of a black sedan waiting at the curb. Ethan climbed inside as water rolled across the windows. The city moved past in blurred reflections. Streetlights, restaurants, apartment buildings, late-night diners, ordinary places he rarely noticed. Tonight he noticed all of them, because somewhere among those lights lived the woman who had tried to warn him, the woman he had fired, the woman who now held the key to saving everything he had spent years building. As the car moved through the rain-soaked streets, Ethan found himself replaying the afternoon again and again. Claire's calm voice, her steady eyes, the folded note, the absence of anger. Most people would have argued. Most people would have defended themselves. She had simply walked away. That realization bothered him more than anything else. Not because she had been right, because she had expected him to be wrong. And now, as the digital clock on the dashboard changed to 10:56 p.m., Ethan Montgomery headed through the storm toward the one conversation he could no longer avoid. The rain had not slowed by the time Ethan's car turned onto Claire's street. Water shimmered beneath the streetlights. Tree branches swayed gently in the wind. The neighborhood felt quiet, ordinary, and completely disconnected from the crisis consuming an entire corporate headquarters downtown. Ethan looked through the window as the sedan rolled to a stop in front of a modest brick apartment building. For a moment, he remained seated. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:12 p.m. Less than 48 minutes remained before midnight. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir." Ethan nodded once and stepped out into the rain. Across town, executives continued working under fluorescent lights, searching for solutions they knew they would not find. Back at Montgomery Holdings, another discovery had emerged. While reviewing archived personnel files, a junior analyst stumbled upon documents connected to Claire's early career. The file quickly found its way to the executive conference room. What they read left the room silent. Claire Bennett had graduated near the top of her class from Northwestern University. She had specialized in financial risk analysis and international compliance. Before joining Montgomery Holdings, she had worked for two respected consulting firms. Several of her early recommendations had saved clients millions of dollars. Her performance reviews described her with the same words repeatedly: precise, thoughtful, exceptionally perceptive. One executive stared at the screen. Why was she working in a restaurant? The chief financial officer answered quietly. After her mother became seriously ill, she requested a transfer closer to home. During restructuring, her department was dissolved. She accepted the only position available rather than leave the company. Nobody spoke after that. The silence carried a different weight now. Not confusion, respect. They were no longer discussing a waitress who happened to be intelligent. They were discussing someone whose expertise had been hiding in plain sight while everyone looked the other way. Meanwhile, Ethan entered the apartment building lobby. The old elevator was out of service. A handwritten sign pointed toward the stairwell. He climbed 5 flights of stairs alone. Each step seemed strangely loud. Somewhere above, a television played softly behind a closed door. A dog barked once and fell silent. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives. Lives untouched by stock prices, investor meetings, and billion-dollar negotiations. By the time he reached the 5th floor, Ethan realized something uncomfortable. He was nervous. Not about Zurich. Not about the deal. About Claire. At apartment 5B, warm light glowed beneath the door. Ethan stopped. Rainwater still clung to his coat. For the first time in years, he had no prepared speech. No strategy. No advantage. Only the truth. Inside the apartment, Claire sat in her armchair reading quietly. She heard footsteps approach, then stop. A moment later came a gentle knock. She closed the book and looked toward the door. Her expression did not change. She had known this moment was coming since noon. The only surprise was how long it had taken. Another knock followed. Soft. Hesitant. Claire stood and crossed the room. As her hand reached the doorknob, the clock on the wall clicked to 11:18 p.m. Outside the door stood one of the most powerful men in Chicago. Inside stood the woman he should have listened to months ago. And for the first time that entire day, both of them understood exactly who held the power now. Claire opened the door. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway light cast a pale glow across the worn carpet. Rainwater dripped quietly from Ethan's coat. Behind Claire, the apartment looked simple and warm. Books lined a shelf near the wall. A lamp illuminated the living room with soft amber light. Nothing about the space suggested power. Yet Ethan had never felt less in control of a conversation. Claire studied him calmly. "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery." Her voice carried no bitterness, no satisfaction, only quiet professionalism. Somehow that made the moment harder. Ethan nodded. "Claire." Silence followed, the kind that revealed more than words. Finally, Claire stepped aside. "You should come in before you catch a cold." Ethan entered slowly. The door closed behind him. The apartment felt worlds away from the glass towers downtown. No assistants. No executives. No board members. Just two people standing in a room where titles suddenly mattered much less. Claire motioned toward a chair. Ethan sat. She remained standing for a moment before taking the seat across from him. Between them rested a small wooden coffee table. A notebook lay open beside a cooling cup of tea. Claire glanced briefly toward the clock on the wall. 11:21 p.m. Ethan noticed the movement. Time. That was why he was here. Yet when he opened his mouth, the first thing he said surprised even himself. I was wrong. Claire looked at him quietly. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. The city hummed somewhere beyond the storm. Ethan continued. About today? About you. The words felt unfamiliar. Heavy. Honest. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar agreements. Apologizing was somehow harder. Claire folded her hands. That is not why you came. Ethan almost smiled. Even now, she went directly to the truth. No, he admitted. It is not. Claire waited. He took a slow breath. The Zurich Consortium is preparing to suspend negotiations. Every problem they identified traces back to issues you reported months ago. We have been trying to solve it all evening. Another silence settled between them. Not hostile. Thoughtful. Claire already knew the answer before he spoke again. And you cannot. Ethan looked down briefly. Then back at her. No. We cannot. For the first time, a faint trace of sadness crossed Claire's face. Not triumph. Sadness. I spent 6 months trying to get people to pay attention to those reports. Ethan nodded. I know. Do you? Her voice remained soft. Because every warning was documented. Every recommendation was submitted. Every concern was explained. Ethan had no defense. The truth sat plainly between them. Claire leaned back slightly. You know what the strangest part is? She asked. Nobody ever told me the analysis was wrong. They simply decided the person delivering it did not matter. The words landed harder than any accusation. Ethan looked around the apartment. The books, the modest furniture, the quiet dignity of the place. He finally understood something he should have understood years earlier. Claire had never needed recognition. She had only wanted someone to listen. The clock ticked softly. 11:26 p.m. Less than 35 minutes remained before midnight. Ethan met her eyes. Claire, I need your help. And for the first time that entire day, he stopped speaking like a billionaire and started speaking like a man with nowhere else to turn. Claire held his gaze for several seconds. The apartment remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Ethan waited. He had spent much of his life making decisions quickly, forcing outcomes, controlling conversations. Tonight, none of those instincts helped him. The answer belonged entirely to Claire. She looked toward the clock. 11:28 p.m. Then back at Ethan. Why? She asked. The question seemed simple. It was not. Ethan frowned slightly. Because the company needs your expertise. Claire shook her head. That is not what I asked. The silence stretched. Ethan understood. She was not asking about Zurich. She was asking about something deeper. Why now? Why after months of ignored reports? Why after being dismissed without a second thought? Ethan leaned forward slowly. Because I finally understand what everyone else should have understood a long time ago. Claire remained silent. Ethan continued. The company does not need your expertise. The company should have respected it from the beginning. For the first time that evening, something softened in Claire's expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But perhaps acknowledgement. She stood and walked toward the bookshelf near the window. Ethan watched as she pulled out a thick binder filled with notes and documents. The edges were worn from use. Colored tabs marked dozens of sections. She placed it gently on the coffee table. Everything you need is in here. Ethan stared at the binder. You kept all of it? Claire almost smiled. Someone had to. Outside, thunder rolled across the city again. Claire opened the binder and flipped through several sections. Charts, risk assessments, compliance reviews, exposure models. Detailed explanations filled every page. Ethan quickly realized something extraordinary. The answers were not being created tonight. They had been created months ago. The crisis was not the result of a lack of preparation. It was the result of a lack of attention. Claire stopped on a particular page and pointed to a highlighted section. This is what Zurich found. Another page. This is why they found it. Another. And this is how to fix it. Ethan studied the material. The logic was clear, elegant, precise. Every concern connected to another. Every recommendation supported the next. The solution suddenly seemed obvious. Not because the problem was simple, because Claire had already solved it long ago. Ethan looked up. You knew this would happen. Claire folded her arms lightly. I hoped it would not. The distinction mattered. Ethan understood that too. She had never wanted to be proven right. She had wanted the company to avoid the problem entirely. The clock changed to 11:35 p.m. 25 minutes remained. Ethan reached for his phone, then paused. Claire. She looked at him. Come back with me. The request lingered between them. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Claire glanced toward the binder, then toward the city beyond the window. Finally she answered, I will help tonight. Ethan exhaled quietly. Relief crossed his face. But before he could speak, Claire continued, Not for you. Not for the deal. And not for the money. Ethan listened carefully. Then why? Claire looked toward the storm-covered skyline. Thousands of lights glowed across the darkness. Because there are people working in that company who did nothing wrong. They should not lose opportunities because leadership failed to listen. Ethan lowered his eyes. The truth of those words struck harder than any criticism. For the second time that night, he found himself with no defense. And for the first time in years, he realized that real leadership might begin with learning how to listen. The drive back to Montgomery Holdings felt completely different. Claire sat in the back seat beside the binder while rain streamed across the windows. Ethan remained unusually quiet. Neither of them wasted time discussing what had happened earlier that day. The past could wait. Midnight could not. When the car arrived downtown at 11:44 p.m., the headquarters still glowed against the storm-dark sky. Entire floors remained illuminated. Employees moved behind glass walls. Phones rang. Screens flickered. The building looked less like a corporation and more like a ship navigating rough water. As soon as Claire entered the executive floor, conversation stopped. People recognized her immediately. Some looked surprised. Others looked embarrassed. A few looked relieved. Claire acknowledged no one. She walked directly into the conference room and opened the binder. Show me the latest communication from Zurich. The request was calm, direct, professional. Within seconds, documents appeared on multiple screens. Claire studied them carefully. The room remained silent. She turned several pages inside her binder, compared figures, cross-referenced reports. Then she pointed toward a section of the display. There. Several executives leaned forward. What are we looking at? Asked the chief legal officer. Claire highlighted a sequence of numbers. They think this exposure originated from an active subsidiary. She moved to another page. It did not. It originated from a legacy reporting structure that was never fully updated after the acquisition. The room grew still. Claire continued. That is why their calculations do not match ours. Both sides are using different assumptions. Ethan watched quietly. For the first time all night, confusion began giving way to clarity. Claire moved through the data with remarkable precision. One question led to another answer. One concern connected to another explanation. Problems that had seemed overwhelming only an hour earlier suddenly appeared solvable. Not because the situation had changed, because someone finally understood it completely. At 11:51 p.m., Claire requested a direct video call with the Zurich consortium. The executives exchanged nervous glances. The request was approved within minutes. Faces appeared on a large conference screen. Senior analysts, attorneys, financial officers, tired people staring across an ocean through technology and deadlines. Claire introduced herself simply. No titles, no explanations. Then she walked them through the issue step by step. Her voice remained steady. Her logic remained clear. She never raised her tone, never rushed, never tried to impress anyone. She simply explained the truth. One concern disappeared. Then another. Then another. Questions became discussions. Discussions became understanding. At 11:58 p.m., the lead representative from Zurich removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair. A faint smile appeared on his face. This explanation resolves our primary concerns. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed. Then came the sentence everyone had been waiting to hear. We are prepared to continue negotiations. Relief swept through the conference room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Several executives closed their eyes. One quietly laughed. Another wiped away tears of exhaustion. Ethan remained standing beside the window. For a moment, he said nothing at all. He simply watched Claire close the binder she had carried all evening. The clock on the wall changed to midnight. The deadline had arrived. The crisis had passed. And the person who saved a billion-dollar deal was not the billionaire. It was the woman whose warnings had been ignored until the very last hour. Morning arrived quietly over Chicago. The storm had passed. Sunlight reflected from glass towers and wet streets as the city returned to its ordinary rhythm. Inside Montgomery Holdings, however, nothing felt quite the same. News of the successful overnight resolution had already spread through the company. Employees who had gone home worried returned carrying cautious optimism. Executives who had expected disaster now walked through the halls with visible relief. Yet the most important meeting of the day had nothing to do with investors, contracts, or financial projections. At 10 o'clock that morning, Ethan Montgomery stood before a gathering of employees in the main auditorium. Hundreds filled the room. Others watched through live video screens across multiple offices. Ethan stepped to the podium and looked across the crowd. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he did something many people in the company had never seen before. He spoke with complete honesty. He described the crisis. He described the warnings that had been overlooked. Most importantly, he described the person who had prevented a costly mistake from becoming a permanent one. Claire sat quietly near the back of the room. She had chosen that seat intentionally. She never enjoyed attention. Ethan looked directly toward her. Yesterday, I made a decision based on assumptions instead of facts. I judged someone by her position instead of her value. I was wrong. The room became perfectly silent. No one expected a billionaire chief executive to say those words publicly. Yet Ethan continued. Leadership is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about listening when wisdom speaks, regardless of where it comes from. Then he invited Claire to join him on stage. She hesitated before walking forward. Not because she was afraid, because she never sought recognition. When she reached the podium, the room rose to its feet. The applause was not loud at first. It grew gradually, warmly, genuinely. Claire looked across the crowd and saw something she had wanted all along. Not admiration, respect. Ethan offered her a senior leadership position overseeing strategic risk analysis for the entire organization. The offer came with every privilege and opportunity the role deserved. Claire accepted, not because of the title, but because it would allow her work to make a difference. Months later, the Zurich partnership became one of the most successful agreements in company history. New jobs were created, new opportunities emerged, and inside Montgomery Holdings, a new principle quietly took root. Listen carefully. Talent does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Sometimes it carries a serving tray. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner. Sometimes it speaks softly enough that pride mistakes silence for insignificance. Ethan never forgot that lesson. Neither did Claire. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not the deal, not the money, not the headlines, but the simple realization that dignity does not need to announce itself to have value. It only needs the chance to be seen. Because in the end, the people we overlook often carry the very answers we need. And if this story reminded you of someone whose quiet strength deserved more recognition, share your thoughts below. Stories like these travel farther when people pass them on. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, resilience, and unexpected wisdom, you are always welcome to join us again for the next one.